Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and soon, I am promised, Henry Hill, deputy editor of ConservativeHome. But let's bring you straight away those front pages. Starting with the Eye, which leads with the continuing flow of migrants across the Channel, despite Britain apparently aiming to fly illegal migrants to Rwanda to try to discourage the traffickers who get them here in the first place. The Telegraph reports on those last-minute efforts by the European Court of Human Rights to stop the deportations. That has been effective, of course, we understand, which says The Guardian has thrown the entire plan into chaos. And after the news that the plane isn't leaving, the Metro calls it a Rwandan air farce. The Financial Times, meanwhile, leads with job losses in the cryptocurrency industry as the value of currencies fall, while The Sun claims an exclusive with news that boxer Tyson Fury is planning a £200 million return to the ring. Well, the horror of horrors, The Star has news of a shortage of flake bars to go into our ice creams in the coming heatwave. More papers due in. We'll bring you those when we see them. Reminder, though, that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's bring in Sonia as we await our other guests. Sonia, down to you for the moment. And, of course, the news tonight that plane, the first plane, this hugely controversial flight to Rwanda has been grounded, as the Daily Telegraph puts it, because of the intervention of European judges.
Yes, this is huge news. So what we've seen in recent days is a number of people on this flight that could have taken up to 300 people to Rwanda come down and down and down as legal challenges were successful in getting people off this flight. And that's because we've got to remember these are people seeking refuge. They fled countries like Iraq, Syria, Iran. We know some of the people due to be on the plane had very serious mental health problems. Doctors have found evidence that they are likely to have been subject to torture in regimes like Iraq. So this is why these legal appeals have been successful. And tonight what we've seen is the European Court of Human Rights stepping in and saying that the flight should not go ahead. And the reason for that is because this is being subject to challenge in the UK's courts. And that judicial review is ongoing. So what the government's always argued is, well, we can just deport people anyway. And if it's found that our actions were unlawful, we'll just bring them back. But what the European Court has said tonight is that actually there aren't good means whereby, it's a different jurisdiction. So how do we know that these people would be able to get back, that they would be able to come back? So that's why it's instructed the government that it needs to wait until this works its way through the British courts and they get a decision on whether this is actually a lawful action or not.
Well, I just had the first reaction from the Home Office, indeed, from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel herself. It's long, I'll read some of it. Earlier this year, I signed a world-leading migration partnership with Rwanda to see those arriving dangerously, illegally, or unnecessarily into the UK relocated to build their lives there. This will help break the people smugglers' business model and prevent loss of life while ensuring protection for the genuinely vulnerable. Always the government's argument, of course. Access to the UK's asylum system must be based on need, not on the ability to pay people smugglers. The demands on the current system, the cost to the taxpayer and the flagrant abuses are increasing, and the British public have rightly had enough. I've always said this policy will not be easy to deliver, and I'm disappointed that legal challenge and last-minute claims have meant today's flight was unable to depart. It is very surprising that the European Court of Human Rights has intervened despite repeated earlier success in our domestic courts. These repeated legal barriers are similar to those we experience with other removals flights, and many of those removed from this flight will be placed on the next. We will not be deterred from doing the right thing and delivering our plans to control our nation's borders. Our legal team are reviewing every decision made on this flight, and preparation for the next flight begins now. And certainly Boris Johnson talked about the intervention of the European Court of Human Rights. The Daily Telegraph says it raises the prospect that ministers could consider renouncing membership of the European Convention on Human Rights to ensure that this scheme can go ahead. Oh, look, Henry Hill has just joined us. Welcome to you from Conservative Home. And the whole point about the European Court of Human Rights is nothing to do with Brexit and the European Union. It's to do with our membership of the Council of Europe and our signatory as being a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. So will it be thrown out by the British government in order for this policy to go ahead? Boris Johnson suggesting that may bring the government into difficulty with more liberal Conservatives. Henry, I don't know how much of that you heard. We just had the first reaction from the Home Secretary. Your reaction to the news then that this plane for Rwanda will not take off?
I think that it's Priti Patel and the Home Office in general have been short on win in recent years as far as they're concerned. And so this looked as if, until the very last moment, it was going to be something that Priti Patel could say that she had managed to actually deliver. As it is, there has been this last-minute intervention. And now, as you mentioned, the government is sort of lurching towards maybe doing something about the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, it's slightly unfortunate the way this has come about. British membership of the ECHR has greatly exercised a section of Conservative opinion for quite a long time, that sort of Conservative legal opinion which feels that we should have an entirely domestic regime of law, and which will be aggravated about the fact that something can be upheld in every single British court and then overruled. But that's a sort of point of principle, and I think it's going to, if you like, as you mentioned, colour any principal case for the repatriation of the legal system entirely to Britain if it is launched on the basis of upholding this particular very controversial policy. The Rwanda deportations do not have universal support amongst the Conservative Parliamentary Party. They speak to a sort of conservatism which I think some Tory MPs are worried is alienating a section of the Conservative base in places like Liberal Democrat facing seats, and is presenting a particular image of the Conservative Party which is perhaps narrower than they would like. So I don't necessarily rule out the government making noises about leaving the ECHR, but that is a big change to our domestic legal order, and whatever the merits of it, Boris Johnson's government has not to date proven particularly effective or indeed enthusiastic about actually delivering on big, complicated pieces of policy change.
And Sonia, quite aside from the legal challenges, of which the European one is the latest, as you know, big questions about the cost of this. The reported price on this plane, which is now not taking off, was, £500,000 rather. The government, I know, says that housing refugees in deportation centres is extremely expensive, but its efficacy as well. And if you look at the eye and the camera pictures we had today, hundreds more crossed the channel. And many of them from our correspondents, both in Calais and in Dover, reported that they had heard nothing about this Rwanda policy. So its act as a deterrent at the moment must also be called into question.
That's right. Well, I think there's so much wrong with Priti Patel's statement that you just read out, Anna, that it's hard to know where to start. You're absolutely right. The government makes a case for this by saying it acts as a deterrent. Actually, the evidence that we do have from, these schemes are very rare because they're thought to break international law, but Israel experimented with trying to forcibly deport refugees to the African continent. And what was found actually was that it dries up people smuggling because people try and get back to the countries that they were trying to get to because they've got family there or they speak the language. So it doesn't have a deterrent effect. So those arguments from the government are made. I think there's a couple of other things to bring up about her statement as well. So she says, I think it's important to stress that numbers arriving in the UK to claim asylum, people fleeing conflict, war, terror, etc., they are actually lower than they were at points in our past. For example, just 20 years ago in the early 2000s, we have far fewer claims for asylum in this country than countries like France and Germany, for example. And we grant refugee status to fewer people per population head than European countries like that as well. So this idea that the system is in crisis just isn't right. It is absolutely true that we don't want people to be attempting this treacherous crossing, of the English Channel because people are losing their lives. But it is just not right to say that numbers of people claiming refuge are higher than they've ever been in the UK, for example. So I think it's really important to
Sonia,
get those facts.
Sorry to interrupt you. I've just seen the time. We're running very late, aren't we? Anyway, that breaking news, we'll keep an eye on reaction to that. Stay there, both of you. Lots more still to come in more of the newspapers. Back in just a moment. You're watching the press preview. With me now, the chief lead writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and Henry Hill, deputy editor of Conservative Home. Welcome back to both of you. Henry, let's go to the FT, shall we? Their first paragraph, if I can read it. Boris Johnson's new cost of living czar is an online entrepreneur who recently called on the Prime Minister to quit and has claimed that voting Tory is a form of self-harm. Discuss, as they say.
I think I'm one of the Prime Minister's critics, but I think that, to be honest, you do need to be prepared to do stuff like this as Prime Minister, not least because when you hit this kind of stage in Boris Johnson's premiership, if you exclude everybody from government who's called on you to resign, you're talking about a decent chunk of Conservative MPs, let alone people in the rest of the country. I think being part of being in government is actually being able to be slightly bigger than that partisanship, to hire in people who don't agree with you, who even have said very mean things about you, if you think they have something to contribute. So I don't know how the cost of living czar is going to do. I have vetted him. But I do think that it is probably a good thing that Boris Johnson still feels, despite being sort of under siege at the moment, still feels able to bring in outside advice from critics.
Yes, this is David Buttress, former chief executive of Just Eat, the online food delivery group, who the government said would help develop and promote initiatives that help households and families with rising costs. We'll see how that goes. In the meantime, a final minute, Sonia, on Grenfell, with this great call still 5 years on for justice, both in terms of any prosecutions and indeed actions that people want to see for other people facing cladding.
That's right. So it was 5 years ago that 72 people lost their lives in the terrible fire at Grenfell. And we had a memorial service today, which was attended by Prince William and his wife and Theresa May and Sadiq Khan. But we've also, very importantly, been hearing from relatives who lost loved ones speaking out today. And what they're saying is they don't want their loved ones' deaths to have been in vain. And we've got this long public inquiry that's ongoing. Only half of the recommendations so far have actually been adopted into law by the government. And we're obviously still waiting for individuals to be held accountable. The Met Police said that they won't be able to run their investigation until the inquiry is concluded. But I think there is a real sense, speaking to the families who were affected by Grenfell, that we suffered this terrible tragedy as a nation 5 years ago, and it just hasn't led to the level of change that you would expect to see.
Sonia Sodha, Henry Hill, great to see both of you. Thank you.